I stood outside my daughter's front door on Christmas Eve, holding the last Christmas ornament my late wife had ever touched, and she told me I wasn't welcome in my own house. My son-in-law looked me in the eye, dropped my gift onto the porch, and shoved me back as their guests watched through the windows. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply turned around and walked away. Because 20 minutes later, every single person inside that Christmas party watched me appear live on national television, and what I revealed destroyed everything they thought they owned. My name is Robert Walker. I'm 60 years old and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina. Before I tell you what happened on that Christmas Eve, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from today? Let me know your city and state in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how many different places people are watching from, and if you've ever been betrayed by someone you loved more than yourself, I think you'll understand every decision I made. For most of my life, I believed there was only one thing more valuable than money: family. I wasn't born into wealth. I wasn't handed a successful business by my parents. Everything I owned came from decades of long days, sleepless nights, missed vacations, and thousands of decisions that nobody ever saw. By the time I finally became successful, I had learned something simple. Money could build a house, but only love could make it a home. For 34 wonderful years, my wife, Linda, made every place we lived feel like home. She had this quiet way of making ordinary moments unforgettable. She loved decorating for Christmas more than anyone I've ever known. Every year, right after Thanksgiving, she'd turn on old holiday music, open the boxes from the attic, and somehow convince me that hanging lights in freezing weather was fun. I'd complain every single year. She'd laugh every single year. And somehow, she always won. Those are the memories I miss the most. Not the expensive vacations, not the promotions, not even the day I bought my dream house. I miss hearing her laugh from the kitchen while she burned the first batch of Christmas cookies because she was too busy singing along with the radio. Life has a strange way of teaching you what really matters. You usually don't realize it until the people you love are gone. 3 years before everything you're about to hear happened, Linda lost her battle with cancer. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about her. Cancer didn't just take my wife, it took the person who made every hard day feel manageable. The hospital room is still burned into my memory. The machines, the silence, the way she smiled at me even though I knew she was in pain. She reached for my hand that afternoon and squeezed it with what little strength she had left. "Robert," she whispered. I leaned closer because her voice had become so soft. "Promise me something." I told her she didn't have to ask. She smiled anyway. "No matter what happens after I'm gone, don't let Emily ever feel like she doesn't have a family." Emily, our only daughter, the little girl who used to run into my arms every evening when I came home from work. The little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder while we watched Christmas movies together. I looked back at Linda and nodded before she even finished speaking. "I promise." At the time, I thought keeping that promise would be easy. How could it not be? Emily was my daughter. I'd loved her from the moment I first held her in the hospital. I'd spent my entire life trying to give her opportunities I never had. I truly believed that no matter how much life changed, we would always have each other. I couldn't have been more wrong. Because sometimes the people you love the most don't leave your life all at once. Sometimes they leave one small piece at a time. One ignored phone call, one forgotten birthday, one broken tradition, one moment of disrespect after another, until one day you wake up and realize the people you've sacrificed everything for no longer see you as family. They see you as an inconvenience. I didn't know it yet. But the promise I made to Linda would eventually cost me almost everything I had. And on one cold Christmas Eve, that promise would be tested in a way I never imagined possible. People often assume that if someone owns a successful company, they must have started with advantages. I didn't. My father worked as a mechanic, and my mother spent most of her life working at a grocery store. We weren't poor enough to go hungry, but we certainly weren't comfortable. If something broke, we fixed it ourselves. If we wanted something extra, we worked for it. Those lessons stayed with me. When I was 24 years old, I rented a tiny warehouse on the edge of Charlotte with money I had saved over 6 years. It wasn't much to look at. The roof leaked every time it rained, the heater barely worked, and my office was nothing more than an old metal desk sitting beside stacked inventory. But I loved every second of it. That little warehouse eventually became Walker Industrial Supply. It didn't happen overnight. For years, I worked 6 days a week, sometimes 7. There were mornings when I unlocked the building before sunrise and nights when I was still there after midnight, sweeping the floor because I couldn't afford to hire someone else to do it. Then Linda came into my life. I met her at a neighborhood charity fundraiser. She wasn't impressed by my business. She wasn't impressed by my ambitions. She laughed because I spilled coffee on my own shirt 5 minutes after introducing myself. "I think your tie survived," she joked. I looked down. The shirt didn't. She laughed again. That laugh changed my life. Linda had a way of making difficult things feel lighter. When the business struggled, she never complained about the long hours. When contracts fell through, she reminded me that one bad month didn't erase years of hard work. She believed in me long before anyone else did. When Emily was born, I thought life couldn't possibly get any better. I still remember holding her in the hospital. She wrapped her tiny fingers around one of mine, and I made another promise that day. I would spend the rest of my life making sure she never had to wonder whether her father loved her. And I meant it. Every decision I made after that revolved around my family. When the company finally became profitable, I didn't buy a sports car. I started Emily's college fund. When the business landed its first $1 million contract, I didn't celebrate with an expensive vacation. Linda and I started looking for the house where we wanted to grow old together. Eventually, we found it. A beautiful 4-bedroom home in Myers Park, one of Charlotte's most established neighborhoods. It wasn't flashy. It was warm. The backyard had 2 enormous oak trees, and Linda immediately said they would be perfect for hanging Christmas lights every December. She was already decorating the place in her mind before we even signed the paperwork. Over the years, that house became the center of our family's life. Every Thanksgiving, every birthday, every Christmas morning, everything happened there. Emily learned to ride her bicycle on that driveway. She carved pumpkins in that kitchen. She danced with me in the living room while Linda played Christmas music far too loudly. Some of the happiest memories of my life were created inside those walls. As Emily grew older, I tried to give her everything I never had. When she wanted to attend a private university, I paid every tuition bill. When she dreamed of studying abroad for a semester, Linda and I made it happen. She graduated without a single dollar of student debt. Not because she asked, because I wanted her to start adulthood with opportunities instead of financial burdens. Then she met Jason Miller. At first, I genuinely liked him. He was confident, well-spoken, and ambitious. He talked about starting his own consulting business, and I admired anyone willing to work hard for their future. When he asked for my blessing to marry Emily, I gave it without hesitation. I believed he loved my daughter. More importantly, I believed he would protect her after I was gone. Looking back now, I wonder if I ever really knew him, or if I only saw the version he wanted me to see. A year after they were married, Jason's business struggled. He never came to me directly. Emily did. She sat across from me at my dining room table with tears in her eyes. "Dad," she whispered, "they're behind on bills." I didn't ask questions. I wrote a check. A few months later, another problem came up. Then another. Then another. Sometimes it was business equipment. Sometimes it was overdue insurance. Sometimes it was payroll. Every single time I helped. Not because Jason deserved it. Because Emily was my daughter. Eventually, they mentioned they were thinking about buying a home. I smiled. Then I told them they didn't have to. Instead, I offered them something I believed any loving father would offer. "Move into my house," I said. "There's more than enough room, and one day it'll be yours anyway." Emily hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Jason shook my hand and thanked me. At least, he did back then. From that day forward, they lived in the Myers Park house without paying rent. I continued paying the property taxes every year. When the roof needed replacing, I paid nearly $22,000 to have it done properly. When the heating and cooling system failed during the summer, I covered another $18,700 without mentioning it again. I hired landscapers because Emily loved having a beautiful yard. I replaced old appliances before they even asked. Whenever something broke, I fixed it. Whenever they needed help, I was there. Not once did I remind them whose name was on the deed. Because in my heart, it wasn't about ownership. It was about family. At least, that's what I still believed back then. If someone had asked me exactly when everything changed, I wouldn't have been able to give them a date. There wasn't one dramatic argument. There wasn't one unforgettable betrayal. It happened so slowly that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. At first, Emily simply became busy. The phone calls that used to happen every Sunday afternoon became once every 2 weeks, then once a month. Then they only happened if I called first. Whenever I asked if everything was all right, she'd always give me the same answer. "We've just been really busy, Dad." I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Jason's consulting business had finally started growing, and Emily had taken a management job with a real estate company. They both worked long hours. I told myself this was normal. Children grow up. They build their own lives. Parents have to let go. That's what I kept repeating to myself. But then little things started happening that had nothing to do with being busy. I'd stop by the house with fresh vegetables from the local farmer's market because Emily used to love cooking. Jason would glance at the bags and say, "You didn't have to do that." His words sounded polite. His tone didn't. I'd offer to fix something around the house and he'd answer before Emily could. I already hired someone, even when I knew he hadn't. Sometimes I'd notice the same broken fence or loose cabinet handle weeks later. He simply didn't want me involved. Emily rarely disagreed with him anymore. She would smile awkwardly and change the subject. At first, I blamed Jason. I told myself he was proud. Maybe he didn't like accepting help from his father-in-law. But over time, I realized something that hurt even more. Emily wasn't being influenced. She was making her own choices. One afternoon, I invited them over for dinner. Linda's chicken pot pie had always been Emily's favorite meal. I spent nearly 4 hours in the kitchen trying to make it exactly the way Linda used to. When everything was ready, I checked my phone. A text message. "Sorry, Dad, something came up. We'll have to rain check." No phone call, no explanation. Just 11 words. I stared at the dining table for a long time that night. 3 plates, 3 glasses, 3 sets of silverware. Only one person showed up. Me. I wrapped the leftovers and put them in the refrigerator. The next morning, I threw most of them away. That wasn't the last time. Birthdays became shorter. Visits became rarer. Conversations became superficial. Emily stopped asking how I was doing. Instead, every conversation somehow became about what needed to be repaired at the house or whether I knew someone who could help Jason with another business contact. I still helped. Every single time. Because every time I considered saying no, I heard Linda's voice. "Don't let Emily ever feel like she doesn't have a family." That promise echoed inside my head more often than I wanted to admit. Then came the first Christmas after Linda passed away. It was painful for all of us. Emily cried while hanging her mother's favorite ornament on the tree. Jason hugged her. We shared stories. We laughed. We even cried together. I remember driving home that night thinking maybe we'd survive our grief after all. But the following Christmas felt different. Jason suggested they host the celebration instead of me. "I think it's time we start our own traditions," he said. It sounded reasonable. So I agreed. That Christmas, I noticed something strange. Linda's old ornaments weren't on the tree. The homemade stockings she'd sewn decades earlier were gone. Even the Christmas music had changed. Everything that reminded Emily of her mother seemed to have quietly disappeared. I asked about one of Linda's ceramic angels. Emily shrugged. It didn't really match the new decorations. I smiled. But inside, something cracked. The traditions Linda had spent 30 years creating were being packed into boxes like they no longer mattered. The next year, Christmas dinner started 2 hours before I was told to arrive. Everyone had already eaten by the time I got there. Emily apologized. Jason said they thought traffic would delay me. Neither explanation made much sense. Still, I let it go. Because that's what I had become. A man who kept letting things go. By the third Christmas, I noticed something else. Whenever guests came over, Jason barely introduced me. "This is Emily's dad." Not, "This is Robert." Not, "This is the man who built this beautiful home." Certainly not. "This is the reason we're able to live here." Just, "Emily's dad." Like I was a distant relative who happened to stop by. The strange part was that none of these moments were big enough to justify a confrontation. Each one, by itself, seemed insignificant. But together, they slowly erased something inside me. Respect doesn't usually disappear overnight. It disappears one ignored conversation, one forgotten invitation, one dismissive comment, one silent disappointment at a time. Looking back now, I think the biggest mistake I made wasn't trusting Emily. It was confusing love with unlimited forgiveness, because every time I accepted another insult without saying a word, I unknowingly taught them that there would never be consequences. And by the time Christmas Eve finally arrived, they truly believed they could treat me however they wanted. They had absolutely no idea that they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of quiet winter morning Linda always loved. Charlotte wasn't covered in snow. It rarely was. But the air had that crisp December bite that made every porch light seem warmer and every Christmas wreath look a little more beautiful. I woke up before sunrise. For a few seconds, lying there in bed, I forgot Linda was gone. For 34 years, Christmas Eve had always started the same way. She would already be awake. I'd smell fresh coffee drifting down the hallway. She'd be humming Christmas songs while pretending she wasn't waiting for me to come downstairs and complain that she'd started decorating before breakfast. Old habits are difficult to lose. Even after 3 years, my mind still reached for a life that no longer existed. I slowly got out of bed, made myself a cup of coffee, and stood in front of the small Christmas tree in my living room. It wasn't nearly as grand as the one Linda used to decorate, but one ornament always hung in the very center, a small hand-painted glass ornament with a tiny gold star. Linda had painted it herself almost 25 years earlier. Emily was 9 years old at the time. The two of them had spent an entire Saturday afternoon covering the dining room table with newspapers and paint bottles. Emily accidentally dropped blue paint across the floor, and I pretended to be angry while they both laughed so hard they could barely breathe. That ornament had become my favorite Christmas possession. I carefully lifted it from the tree and wrapped it inside soft white tissue paper before placing it into a small gift box. "This one's coming with me today," I whispered. Next, I walked into my study. Inside the top drawer of my desk was a velvet jewelry box. I opened it slowly. Linda's pearl necklace rested exactly where I'd left it after her funeral. She had worn it every Christmas dinner for nearly 20 years. Months earlier, I'd decided this Christmas would be the right time to give it to Emily. I wanted her to have something that belonged to her mother, not because it was expensive, because it carried memories. I slipped the jewelry box into a gift bag. Then I picked up a framed family photograph. It had been taken 12 years earlier. Linda stood between Emily and me in front of our fireplace. Emily had one arm around her mother and the other around me. Every one of us was laughing, not posing, actually laughing. Looking at that picture always reminded me that once upon a time we really had been happy. I loaded everything into my car. The ornament, the necklace, the photograph. I even brought one of Linda's homemade pecan pies using the recipe she'd written by hand years before. By late afternoon, I was driving toward Myers Park. Christmas lights covered nearly every street. Children played in front yards wearing Santa hats. Neighbors waved at one another while carrying wrapped presents across sidewalks. It felt like the kind of evening Linda would have called perfect. As I turned onto the street where my house stood, I immediately noticed how many cars were parked outside. Luxury SUVs, new European sedans. Even a valet service had been hired. I smiled to myself. Emily had always loved hosting parties. I parked a short distance away, straightened my jacket, picked up the gifts, and walked toward the front door. The house looked beautiful. White lights framed every window. Fresh garland wrapped around the porch columns. A giant Christmas tree glowed through the front window. For just a moment, I forgot every disappointment of the past few years. I wasn't thinking about disrespect. I wasn't thinking about hurt feelings. I was simply a father excited to spend Christmas Eve with his daughter. I rang the doorbell. Inside, I heard laughter, music, glasses clinking together. Footsteps approached. The front door opened only halfway. Emily stood there wearing a dark green dress. She looked beautiful. She also looked surprised, not happy. Surprised. "Dad?" Her smile disappeared almost immediately. "I wasn't expecting you this early." I laughed softly. "You told me 6 o'clock." She looked back over her shoulder before lowering her voice. "Can we talk for a second?" Something inside me tightened. Of course. She stepped onto the porch and quietly pulled the front door behind her until it nearly closed. "Listen," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Tonight's a little different." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "We've invited some important people." I waited. She continued. "Jason has clients here, investors, people we've been trying to impress." I still didn't understand. "That's wonderful," I said. "I'd love to meet them." She took a slow breath. "I don't think that's a good idea." For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. "What?" She folded her arms. "Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be." The words felt strangely rehearsed. "I just don't think tonight is the right night." I stared at my own daughter. "I was invited." "I know. Then why am I standing outside?" Before she could answer, the front door opened wider. Jason stepped onto the porch holding a glass of wine. He looked at me, then at the gift bags in my hands, then back at Emily. "Everything all right?" Emily hesitated. Jason didn't. He smiled politely. "Robert, we're actually in the middle of something." "I can see that. We're entertaining clients." "So?" He sighed. "It would just be better if you came another day." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This is Christmas Eve. I know. I've spent every Christmas with my family for over 30 years. Jason's smile disappeared. "This isn't the time." I looked at Emily. She said nothing, not one word. I slowly held out the small gift bag. "I brought your mother's necklace." Emily glanced at it, then looked away. Jason reached forward before she could move. "I'll take that." Instead of accepting it carefully, he grabbed the bag carelessly. The framed photograph slipped from under my arm. I bent to catch it. At the same moment, Jason let the gift bag fall onto the porch. The velvet jewelry box tumbled out. The little package containing Linda's ornament rolled across the wooden floorboards until it stopped beside the welcome mat. My heart nearly stopped. I immediately knelt to pick it up. As I reached for it, Jason placed a firm hand against my shoulder. "Robert," I looked up. "I think it's time for you to go." Then he pushed me backward. It wasn't hard enough to knock me down, it didn't have to be. The message was perfectly clear. Behind him, I could see guests standing inside the foyer. Several of them had watched everything. Nobody spoke. Nobody stepped forward. I slowly picked up Linda's ornament with trembling hands. I dusted it off. Then I looked at Emily one last time. She finally met my eyes. For one brief second. I thought she might stop all of this. I thought she might tell Jason to apologize. Instead, she quietly said the words that broke whatever remained of my heart. "Dad, please just leave." And then, she closed the door. For a long moment, I just stood there. The front door was closed. The music inside started again as if nothing had happened. People laughed. Glasses clinked together. Someone inside wished everyone a Merry Christmas, and I was standing outside my own house holding a small glass ornament with both hands like it was the last thing keeping me together. I looked down at it. Somehow it hadn't broken. Linda always used to joke that it was tougher than it looked. "So am I," she'd laugh whenever I teased her about making it by hand. I wish she had been right about both. I carefully wrapped the ornament back in the tissue paper and picked up the velvet jewelry box from the porch. The family photograph had landed face down on the welcome mat. I turned it over, relieved to see the glass hadn't cracked. At least something had survived the evening. I walked slowly back to my car. Nobody followed me. Nobody called my name. Nobody even opened the door to see if I was all right. As I started the engine, I could still see the warm glow from the living room windows. Emily was somewhere inside that house, probably smiling, probably introducing Jason's clients to one another, probably pretending nothing had happened. I rested both hands on the steering wheel but couldn't bring myself to drive. The windshield had begun to fog from my breathing. For the first time since Linda died, I cried. Not because of the house, not because of the money, not even because Jason had pushed me. I cried because my own daughter had watched it happen and decided that keeping her guests comfortable mattered more than protecting her father. I closed my eyes. Without thinking, I reached toward the passenger seat. For 34 years, Linda had always sat there. Even after 3 years, part of me still expected to find her. Instead, there was only silence. "I kept my promise," I whispered. My voice cracked. "I never stopped showing up." Memories began flooding through my mind. Emily's first Christmas, helping her ride a bicycle, teaching her how to drive, walking her down the aisle on her wedding day, writing check after check whenever she needed help, replacing the roof, paying the property taxes, repairing the furnace, making sure she never worried about where she would live. Every sacrifice, every late night, every promise, every Christmas. And somehow, it still wasn't enough. Then I remembered something Mark Bennett had said 3 weeks earlier. Mark had been my attorney for almost 20 years, but more importantly, he had become a close friend. When I first told him I wanted to create the Linda Walker Foundation, he had smiled. "Robert," he'd said, "this foundation will outlive both of us." "It isn't about me," I answered. "I know." It never was. The foundation had already been legally established. All that remained was signing the final transfer documents after my television interview. Originally, I had planned to leave part of my estate to Emily and donate the rest. That had been Linda's dream. She wanted abandoned seniors and families battling terminal illness to receive help they otherwise couldn't afford. I wanted that too. But I had also wanted to make sure Emily was secure. Now, for the first time, I questioned whether security without gratitude was really a gift. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my coat and took a long breath. No, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making Emily suffer. It was about finally accepting a truth I had refused to see. Love doesn't require you to surrender your dignity. Kindness doesn't mean allowing people to humiliate you. And honoring Linda's memory didn't mean rewarding behavior that would have broken her heart. I reached into the center console and picked up my phone. There were no missed calls, no messages. Not from Emily, not from Jason. Apparently, they hadn't even noticed I was gone. Or worse, they had noticed and simply didn't care. I opened my contacts and tapped Mark Bennett. He answered before the second ring. "Robert, Merry Christmas." I smiled faintly. "Merry Christmas, Mark. You sound tired." "I've had a change of plans." There was a pause. "What happened?" "I'll tell you everything later." Another pause. Then he said quietly, "Do you still want to go through with the interview?" I looked back at the house one last time. The lights were beautiful. The people inside looked happy. And for the first time in my life, I realized that house no longer felt like home. "Yes," I answered calmly. "I'm on my way." "What about the estate documents?" I looked down at Linda's ornament resting safely on the passenger seat. "The foundation gets everything." Mark didn't speak for several seconds. When he finally did, his voice was steady. "I'll have the revised documents waiting when you get here." I ended the call, shifted the car into drive, and slowly pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the Christmas lights grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared completely. I had driven away from that house thousands of times before, but this was the first time. I wasn't planning to come back. The television studio was only about 20 minutes away, but it felt like I had driven across an entire lifetime. By the time I pulled into the parking garage, the tears had dried on my face. I looked in the rearview mirror. My eyes were red. The lines around them seemed deeper than they had that morning. For a second, I thought about canceling everything. I wasn't in the right state of mind. I had just been thrown out of my own home by my own daughter. How was I supposed to sit under bright studio lights and smile for the cameras? Then I looked at the small gift box on the passenger seat, Linda's ornament. I picked it up and held it in my hands. "I almost didn't make it today," I whispered, "but I think you'd want me to." I slipped the ornament into the inside pocket of my coat and walked into the building. The lobby was decorated for Christmas. A massive tree stood near the reception desk, surrounded by wrapped presents that were part of a local toy drive. Employees hurried through the hallway carrying coffee cups, clipboards, and headsets. Everyone seemed cheerful. Nobody had any idea what had happened to me less than an hour earlier. "Mr. Walker?" I turned. A young production assistant hurried toward me with a warm smile. "We're so glad you're here. We're live in about 25 minutes. I'll be ready." She led me toward the green room. As soon as the door opened, I saw Mark Bennett standing beside a small conference table. He wasn't wearing his usual courtroom suit. Instead, he had on a dark blue blazer and a Christmas tie covered with tiny silver snowflakes. The moment he saw my face, his smile disappeared. "What happened?" I closed the door behind me. Then, for the first time that evening, I told someone the truth. I told him about Emily, about Jason, about standing on the porch, about the necklace falling onto the floor, about being pushed away, about hearing my own daughter tell me to leave. Mark didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, he slowly took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "I've represented families for almost 30 years, he said quietly, "and I still can't understand how people can treat their parents this way." Neither could I. He opened a leather folder and slid several documents across the table. "I revised everything after your call." I looked down. The heading read, "The Linda Walker Foundation." Every page had already been prepared. My ownership in Walker Industrial Supply, the Myers Park House, my investment accounts, commercial property, savings, everything. I picked up the pen. My hand hesitated for only a moment, not because I doubted my decision, because I wished I didn't have to make it. I signed the first page, then the second, then the third. By the time I reached the final signature, I felt strangely calm. Mark gathered the papers carefully. "Once tonight's announcement is made, these become effective immediately." I nodded. "That's what I want." He looked at me for a long moment. "Are you absolutely certain?" I thought about the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during Christmas movies. Then I thought about the woman who had looked me in the eye less than an hour ago and told me to leave. Those were no longer the same person. "Yes," I answered. "I've never been more certain." A producer knocked gently on the door. "We're ready for you, Mr. Walker." Mark placed a hand on my shoulder. "No matter what happens tonight, Linda would be proud of the man sitting in front of me." For the first time all evening, I smiled. "Thank you." The studio lights were brighter than I remembered. Large television cameras moved silently across the polished floor. Crew members counted down the final minutes before the broadcast. The host, Daniel Harper, walked over and shook my hand. "It's an honor to have you here." "Thank you. I've heard wonderful things about your company." "That's kind of you." He glanced at his notes. "We'll talk about your business, your career, and the new charitable foundation you're launching." I nodded. There was no script for what I planned to say. Nobody had prepared me for the conversation that was about to happen. The floor manager raised 3 fingers. 3, 2, 1. The red camera light switched on. Daniel smiled directly into the lens. "Good evening, everyone, and Merry Christmas. Tonight we're joined by one of Charlotte's most respected business leaders, Robert Walker, founder of Walker Industrial Supply. After decades of success, Mr. Walker has announced an extraordinary new charitable initiative that is already drawing national attention." He turned toward me. "Mr. Walker, welcome. It's good to be here. For those who may not know your story, how would you describe the life you've built?" I smiled gently. "I'd like to think I built more than a business." "And what do you mean by that?" "I spent my life believing that success wasn't measured by how much money I earned. It was measured by how well I took care of the people I loved." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That's a beautiful philosophy." It was. He noticed the change in my voice. "Was?" I took a slow breath. Then I reached into my coat pocket and carefully placed Linda's small hand-painted ornament on the table between us. Daniel looked at it. "That's beautiful. My wife painted it 25 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss." "So am I." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel quietly asked the question that changed everything. "Mr. Walker, after building such a successful life, what has been the hardest lesson you've ever learned?" I looked directly into the camera. Not at Daniel. Not at the audience in the studio. Straight into the homes of millions of people watching across the country. "My wife taught me that love means showing up," I began. "So I spent years showing up for my family. I paid their bills when they struggled. I gave them my home. I protected them even when they hurt me. I paused. My biggest mistake was believing that unconditional love meant accepting unconditional disrespect. The studio became completely silent. Daniel didn't interrupt. He simply let me continue. Less than an hour ago, I stood outside the front door of the home I legally own, hoping to spend Christmas Eve with my only daughter. I swallowed hard. Instead, I was told I would embarrass her in front of her guests. I could hear someone behind one of the cameras quietly inhale. My son-in-law pushed me away from the front door, and my daughter asked me to leave. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shouting. That made the words feel even heavier. I rested my hand on Linda's ornament. So tonight, I've decided to honor the woman who spent her life teaching our family what kindness really looks like. I looked down briefly at the ornament, then back into the camera. Effective immediately, I am donating my company, my home, and the overwhelming majority of my estate to the Linda Walker Foundation, which will provide housing assistance for abandoned seniors and financial support for families caring for loved ones with terminal illnesses. The silence inside the studio became almost overwhelming. I continued quietly, because I've learned that an inheritance should never be based solely on blood. It should be earned through love, gratitude, and character. No one moved, no one spoke, and somewhere across Charlotte, in a beautifully decorated house filled with Christmas guests, I had no idea that someone had just reached for a television remote. I didn't know exactly what was happening inside the house while I was still sitting beneath those bright studio lights. Later, I learned every single detail. One of Jason's clients had stepped away from the living room to answer a phone call. As he walked past the den, he noticed the television was already tuned to the network airing my interview. At first, he stopped because he recognized my name. Then he turned the volume up. "Hey," he called toward the living room. "Isn't this your father-in-law?" The music kept playing for another few seconds. People continued talking. Then one by one, conversations faded. Someone picked up the remote and muted the Christmas playlist. Every eye in the room turned toward the television. Emily looked over her shoulder. Jason slowly set his drink down. Neither of them expected to see me calmly sitting beside a national television host, and neither of them expected to hear me say the words that came next. "I am donating my company, my home, and the overwhelming majority of my estate to the Linda Walker Foundation." According to one of the guests who later contacted me, the room went completely silent. No one reached for another drink. No one laughed. No one even looked at the food spread across the dining table. They simply watched. When the interviewer asked why I had made that decision, my answer echoed through the house. Because love without respect eventually becomes permission for abuse. Emily's face reportedly lost all its color. Jason immediately grabbed his phone. He called me once, then again, then again. Each call went straight to voicemail. One of Jason's business clients finally broke the silence. "Wait." He looked around the room. "Did he just say his house?" Another guest answered before Emily could. "I thought you two owned this place." No one spoke. Jason tried to force a smile. "It's complicated." But it wasn't complicated anymore. The truth had just been spoken in front of millions of viewers. Another guest quietly picked up her purse. "I think we should go." Within moments, others did the same. Some wished Emily a quiet Merry Christmas. Most said nothing at all. The party that had seemed so important less than an hour earlier began falling apart in complete silence. As guests walked out the front door, they looked at the same porch where I had been standing only minutes before. Now they understood why. Before the night was over, my phone showed 23 missed calls, 12 text messages from Jason, 8 from Emily. I didn't open a single one, for the first time in years. They finally knew what it felt like when someone they loved refused to answer. The weeks after Christmas were quieter than I expected. Not because people stopped talking, because I finally did. Mark handled every legal step exactly as we had planned. Ownership of Walker Industrial Supply, the Myers Park House, and the rest of the assets transferred into the Linda Walker Foundation. The foundation's mission was simple: help elderly people who had been abandoned and support families caring for loved ones with terminal illnesses, the kind of compassion Linda had always believed the world needed more of. Emily and Jason called for days. Then they emailed. Then they sent letters. Every message sounded different from the one before. First came anger, then excuses, then apologies. Finally, there were promises. Promises that things would change. Promises that they had made a terrible mistake. Promises that we could be a family again. I read every letter. I answered none of them. Some wounds deserve forgiveness, but not every wound should be given another chance to happen. A few months later, Emily and Jason moved out of the Myers Park house. It was renovated and reopened as the first community resource center operated by the Linda Walker Foundation. Every time I visited, I saw people walking through those front doors with hope instead of entitlement. I eventually moved into a smaller home just outside Charlotte. It had a modest front porch, a quiet backyard, and one living room window that faced the sunrise. Every Christmas Eve, I still decorate one small tree. And every year, before I place the first ornament on its branches, I take out the little hand-painted glass ornament Linda made 25 years ago. I hold it for a moment. I smile. Then I whisper the same words I should have said long before that Christmas night. I kept my promise, Linda. But this time, I finally kept it without losing myself. Looking back, I don't believe the greatest loss in my life was the money, the house, or even the company. The greatest loss would have been losing my self-respect just to keep people happy who had already stopped valuing me. I still love my daughter, and I always will, but I finally learned that love without respect isn't healthy for anyone. Now I'd love to hear from you. Do you think I did the right thing, or would you have handled it differently? Share your thoughts in the comments because I read as many as I can. And if my story taught you something valuable about family, respect, and knowing your worth, please subscribe and hit the bell icon to join us every day for more powerful stories. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and never let kindness cost you your dignity.